Hi, I'm Charlotte Whitman, and 8 months ago, I thought the worst pain I'd ever experienced was losing my baby at 6 months pregnant. I was wrong. The worst pain was watching my sister Rebecca walk into our family's annual 4th of July gathering wearing my wedding dress, the same dress I'd worn 3 years earlier when I promised to love and cherish my husband Daniel through sickness and health. The same dress that had been hanging untouched in my closet since the day we buried our daughter Emma. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Rebecca stood there in the doorway of our parents' estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, her perfectly flat stomach mocking the belly I'd never get to see grow again. She smoothed the silk down over her hips with theatrical precision, her eyes finding mine across the crowded room with laser-like accuracy. The smile she gave me wasn't sisterly warmth. It was pure, calculated malice wrapped in designer fabric and family tradition. But here's what Rebecca didn't know: when she chose that dress, when she chose that moment, when she chose to turn my deepest grief into her personal entertainment. Our father wasn't just any overprotective parent. Justice William Whitman had spent 30 years on the Supreme Court of the United States, and he had very strong opinions about justice, accountability, and protecting the people he loved. In the morning, everything changed. It started like most of my mornings since March, with the kind of silence that follows you from room to room, no matter how many lights you turn on or how loud you play the music. I sat in the breakfast nook of our townhouse in Georgetown, watching Daniel pack his briefcase for another day at the State Department. At 32, my husband had already made a name for himself in international trade negotiations, but success felt hollow when you were using work to avoid the nursery you'd never finish decorating. The coffee in my hands had gone cold 20 minutes ago, but I kept drinking it anyway, needing the ritual of something familiar in a world that had felt foreign since we'd lost Emma. March 15th. The date lived in my mind like a scar you couldn't stop touching. That was the day Dr. Martinez had looked at me with those carefully practiced eyes that medical professionals develop after years of delivering devastating news, and told me what the sudden absence of movement had already whispered. "Sometimes these things just happen," she'd said, her voice gentle but clinical. There was nothing you could have done differently. But I'd stopped listening after the words were no longer viable, because how do you process that? The future you'd painted in careful watercolors, the first steps, the bedtime stories, the Christmas mornings filled with wrapping paper and laughter, had all become past tense in the space of an ultrasound appointment. Daniel had held my hand through the whole ordeal, his thumb tracing circles against my palm while doctors explained procedures and recovery timelines. He'd taken 3 weeks off work, something unprecedented in his career, and held me while I cried until there were no more tears left. He'd handled the funeral arrangements, the flowers, the difficult phone calls to relatives who didn't know what to say. But even Daniel, with all his diplomatic training in managing impossible situations, couldn't navigate the particular cruelty of family dynamics when grief makes people show their true colors. Within a week of Emma's service, my mother Patricia was suggesting I get back to my charity work with the Kennedy Center. Within a month, she was hinting that dwelling on the loss wasn't healthy, and that maybe it was time to start thinking about trying again. It was Rebecca who really showed me how alone I was in this particular kind of pain. My sister, 18 months younger and infinitely more fertile, had managed to get pregnant 3 times in the 5 years since I'd been married. Her son Marcus was 4, her daughter Lily was 2, and she was currently carrying what she'd announced would be their final child, a boy they planned to name after our father. She'd called me exactly 1 week after Emma's funeral, her voice bubbling with the kind of excitement that comes from someone who's never had to question whether their body would do what they wanted it to do. "Charlotte, I have news," she'd said, not bothering to ask how I was managing or whether I was ready to hear about other people's successful pregnancies. "We're expecting again. Can you believe it? 3 kids under 5. We're gonna be so busy, but I'm just thrilled. This one feels different somehow, like it was meant to be." I'd congratulated her, of course. I'd made the appropriate excited sounds and asked about due dates and whether she'd told the kids yet. I'd done everything a supportive sister should do while feeling like someone was slowly removing my lungs through my throat. Because that's what good people do, isn't it? They celebrate other people's happiness, even when their own hearts are breaking into smaller and smaller pieces. The wedding dress had been stored in our bedroom closet since our third anniversary, carefully preserved in acid-free tissue paper and a museum-quality garment bag. It was a Vera Wang masterpiece that had cost more than most people's cars, silk charmeuse with hand-sewn crystal beading, and a cathedral train that had required 3 bridesmaids to manage during the ceremony. The dress had been featured in Town and Country magazine as part of their Washington Wedding of the Year coverage, photographed in loving detail from every possible angle. I felt like a princess wearing it down the aisle of St. John's Episcopal Church, my father's proud smile waiting for me at the altar next to Daniel's nervous grin. The ceremony had been everything we'd dreamed of, intimate despite its grandeur, meaningful despite its expense, and absolutely perfect in every way that mattered. Rebecca had been my maid of honor, naturally. Our parents had insisted, and I hadn't had the energy to argue about something that seemed so traditional and expected. She'd looked beautiful in the dusty rose bridesmaid dress we'd chosen together, had given a speech at the reception that made everyone laugh and cry in all the right places, had helped me bustle my train for the first dance with my new husband. To anyone watching, we'd looked like the perfect sisterly team, united in celebrating love and new beginnings and all the promise that comes with starting a life together. But I'd caught something in her expression during the father-daughter dance, when Justice Whitman had whispered in my ear about how proud he was and how beautiful I looked. Rebecca had been watching from the head table, her smile not quite reaching her eyes, her fingers twisted around the stem of her champagne flute in a way that suggested she was gripping it tighter than necessary. At the time, I'd chalked it up to normal sisterly feelings, maybe a little envy about the attention, maybe some sadness that her own wedding to Michael 3 years earlier had been a simpler affair in their hometown of Richmond. Rebecca and Michael were both teachers, living comfortable but modest lives, and our parents had helped with their wedding costs as much as they could. But Daniel's family had insisted on paying for our celebration, and the result had been something far grander than anything Rebecca had experienced. I'd pushed those observations aside, convincing myself that I was reading too much into momentary expressions caught in wedding day emotions. Rebecca was married to Michael after all. She had her own family, her own version of happiness, her own path through life that didn't need to intersect with mine in any competitive way. But then came the pregnancies, first mine, successful and celebrated, resulting in Emma's brief, beautiful life. Then mine again, the one that ended in loss and grief and the kind of silence that follows you everywhere. And then Rebecca's, announced with perfect timing just when my own healing was most fragile, delivered with the kind of casual joy that suggested she'd never questioned whether she deserved the good things that happened to her. Rebecca and I had never been particularly close, not in the way sisters were supposed to be according to greeting cards and holiday movies. She was the younger one, the one who'd been babied and protected throughout our childhood in ways that had made her both charming and somewhat entitled. I was the serious one, the achiever, the daughter who'd followed our father into law school before ultimately choosing nonprofit work over litigation. Growing up in the shadow of Justice Whitman's career had shaped both of us in different ways. I'd embraced the pressure and expectations, graduating magna cum laude from Georgetown Law before choosing to work with arts organizations rather than pursue the Supreme Court clerkship our father had hoped I'd want. Rebecca had rebelled against the academic pressure by choosing education over law, marrying young, and starting a family as quickly as possible. Our parents had supported both paths with equal enthusiasm, or so it seemed, but I'd always suspected that Rebecca felt overshadowed by my achievements, and by the obvious pride our father took in my career choices and marriage to Daniel. She'd made subtle comments over the years about how easy things seemed to come to me, how fortunate I was to have found success in both work and love without having to struggle the way she had. The comments had been gentle enough that I'd never addressed them directly. Rebecca wasn't cruel, just occasionally envious in the way that siblings sometimes are when they compare their internal struggles to their sister's external successes. I'd assumed it was normal family dynamics, the kind of minor tensions that most families navigate without major incident. But losing Emma had changed everything about how I perceived the people around me and their reactions to my pain. Grief had stripped away my ability to make excuses for other people's behavior, or to minimize my own emotional needs for the sake of family harmony. When you're drowning, you notice very clearly who throws you a life preserver and who stands on the shore taking pictures of your struggle. Rebecca had done neither. She'd done something worse. She'd used my drowning as an opportunity to showcase her own swimming skills. Every phone call included updates about her healthy pregnancy. Every family gathering featured discussions of nursery preparations and name selections, and all the countless small joys of carrying a child to term. Each conversation felt like a paper cut, small enough to ignore individually, but accumulating into something that eventually drew blood. The invitation to our parents' annual 4th of July celebration had arrived in June, written in our mother's careful script on cream-colored cardstock that matched the elegant simplicity of everything Patricia Whitman organized. The party was a Washington tradition, attended by Supreme Court justices, senators, cabinet members, and the kind of power brokers who shaped policy over cocktails and carefully curated conversation. Hi, Day. This year's theme was American Traditions, with a requested dress code of classic American elegance. Guests were encouraged to wear clothing that celebrated the timeless style that had defined American fashion through the decades. The invitation had felt like a gentle nudge back toward normal social engagement, our parents' way of suggesting that I was ready to rejoin the world of public appearances and family obligations. I'd planned to wear a navy silk dress from my pre-pregnancy wardrobe, something appropriately patriotic and elegantly understated. I'd even made an appointment to have my hair styled, the first time I'd bothered with such things since losing Emma. The party would be my first major social appearance since the funeral, and I wanted to make the effort for my parents' sake if not for my own. Daniel had been supportive but cautious about my decision to attend. He knew how difficult family gatherings had become, how every conversation seemed to include well-meaning but painful questions about our future plans or suggestions about moving forward. But he also understood that avoiding family forever wasn't a sustainable strategy, and our parents had been nothing but loving and supportive throughout our loss. That morning, I'd stood in our walk-in closet trying to convince myself that I was ready for this kind of public appearance when I saw it again, my wedding dress, hanging in its preservation bag like a ghost of happier times. For just a moment, I'd allowed myself to remember what it had felt like to wear it, to be surrounded by love and hope and the absolute certainty that Daniel and I could handle whatever the future brought us. The irony wasn't lost on me that American Traditions would have been the perfect theme for displaying the dress that had once represented everything I'd believed about love, commitment, and the future we were building together. But that dress belonged to a different woman, one who'd never had to question whether her body could do what she desperately wanted it to do. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Instead, I'd chosen the navy dress and headed for Georgetown, leaving the wedding gown behind like all the other dreams that no longer had anywhere to go. The drive to our parents' estate had taken 40 minutes through holiday traffic, giving me plenty of time to prepare myself mentally for questions about how I was doing and whether Daniel and I were considering trying again. What I hadn't prepared myself for was walking into the grand foyer of our childhood home and seeing Rebecca standing there in my wedding dress, accepting compliments from our parents' guests about how stunning she looked and how perfectly the vintage styling captured the theme of American elegance through the decades. She'd seen me immediately, of course. Rebecca had always been skilled at reading rooms and timing her moments for maximum impact. The smile she'd given me across the crowded space was sharp and satisfied, the expression of someone who'd successfully achieved exactly the reaction she'd been hoping for. That's when I realized that this wasn't about sibling rivalry or pregnancy hormones or even garden variety cruelty. This was about power. The power to hurt me when I was most vulnerable. The power to take something precious and transform it into a weapon. The power to do it all while maintaining the appearance of innocent sisterly behavior. But Rebecca had made one critical miscalculation. She'd assumed that because I was grieving I was weak. She'd assumed that because I'd been quiet about my pain, I wouldn't fight back. Most importantly, she'd assumed that our father's love for family harmony would outweigh his commitment to justice. She was about to learn how wrong she was about all three assumptions. The weeks following the 4th of July party revealed a pattern I'd been too grief-stricken to notice before. Rebecca's cruelty wasn't spontaneous. It was calculated, systematic, and perfectly timed to inflict maximum damage when I was least able to defend myself. It started with the photos. Within hours of the party, Rebecca had posted a series of images on social media showing herself in my wedding dress, posing in our parents' garden with captions about honoring family traditions and celebrating timeless elegance. The comments poured in from relatives and family friends who had no idea they were looking at my stolen wedding gown, praising Rebecca for her impeccable taste and asking where she'd found such a stunning vintage piece. "Found this gorgeous dress in Charlotte's closet," she'd written in response to one comment. "She said I could borrow it since she's not using it anymore. Sisters share everything, right?" The casual lie was breathtaking in its audacity. I'd never given her permission to touch my wedding dress, let alone wear it to a family gathering, where it would be photographed and celebrated by people who'd witnessed my actual wedding. But the social media posts were just the beginning. Over the following days, Rebecca launched what could only be described as a campaign of psychological warfare disguised as sisterly concern. She called me every few days with updates about her pregnancy, always managing to work in comments about how different this experience felt from her previous two, how much more connected she felt to this baby, how she was certain this child was meant to be. "I think losing Emma really put things in perspective for me," she said during one particularly cruel phone call. "It made me realize how precious and fragile life is, how we shouldn't take anything for granted. I'm so much more grateful for this pregnancy, because I know what it's like to watch someone else lose what they want most." The way she talked about my daughter's death as her own learning experience was nauseating. Emma's brief life and tragic death had become Rebecca's personal growth story, a cautionary tale that made her appreciate her own fertility even more. She spoke about my loss the way people talk about movies that taught them important lessons, emotional content to be processed and then applied to their own superior circumstances. The pattern extended beyond phone calls. At family dinners, Rebecca would position herself so that her growing belly was always visible, constantly touching her stomach and making comments about the baby's movements. She'd bring up pregnancy symptoms she was experiencing, comparing them favorably to things she'd heard about other women's more difficult experiences. "I feel so lucky that this pregnancy has been so easy," she'd say, her hand resting protectively on her bump while looking directly at me. "Some women have such a hard time, with complications and losses and all sorts of medical issues. I just feel blessed that my body knows what to do naturally." The implication was always clear. Her body was superior to mine, her pregnancies more successful, her maternal instincts more developed. She never said anything directly insulting, but every comment was designed to highlight the difference between her reproductive success and my devastating failure. Our mother Patricia seemed oblivious to the subtext, always responding to Rebecca's comments with appropriate maternal enthusiasm. She'd coo over ultrasound photos and discuss nursery preparations and baby name possibilities, while I sat silently, trying to keep my face neutral and my emotions in check. Patricia had always been skilled at maintaining surface-level family harmony, preferring to ignore uncomfortable undercurrents rather than address them directly. Our father was harder to read. Justice Whitman had built his career on careful observation and analytical thinking, and I sometimes caught him watching Rebecca during these family interactions with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. He never said anything in the moment, but his eyes would linger on her face when she made her pointed comments, as if he was filing away information for future consideration. The most devastating pattern was Rebecca's timing. She had an uncanny ability to call or visit or post something particularly painful whenever I was having a better day. If Daniel and I went out to dinner and I posted a photo of us smiling, Rebecca would call the next morning with pregnancy updates. If I shared news about a successful fundraising event at work, she'd respond with ultrasound photos. If I seemed to be healing or moving forward in any small way, she'd find a method to remind me of what I'd lost and what she still had. The wedding dress incident had revealed something else troubling. Rebecca had been in our house, in our bedroom, going through my personal belongings without permission. The dress had been stored in the back of our walk-in closet, behind winter coats and formal wear I rarely accessed. Finding it required deliberate searching, not casual browsing. When I'd confronted her about it during a family dinner 2 weeks after the party, Rebecca's response had been a masterclass in manipulation and gaslighting. She'd looked genuinely confused by my anger, tilting her head with the expression of someone trying to understand an unreasonable reaction. "Charlotte, you're being dramatic," she'd said. Her voice gentle but condescending. "I asked if I could borrow something dressy for the party, and you said to look through your closet. I found the dress and thought it was perfect for the theme. I even complimented you on your excellent taste." The lie was so smooth, so confident, that for a moment I'd almost believed her myself. Had I given her permission to go through my closet? Had I been so distracted by grief that I'd forgotten an entire conversation? The self-doubt was exactly what Rebecca was counting on, the possibility that my emotional state had compromised my memory and judgment. But Daniel had been there for every interaction between Rebecca and me since Emma's death, and he'd never heard me give her permission to borrow anything, especially not my wedding dress. When I'd told him about Rebecca's version of events, his expression had gone cold in a way I'd rarely seen. "She's lying," he'd said simply, "and she's counting on your grief to make you question your own memory. That's not sisterly behavior, Charlotte. That's psychological abuse." The accusation had felt too strong at the time. Psychological abuse seemed like something that happened in obviously dysfunctional relationships, not between sisters who'd grown up in the same privileged household with loving parents. But as I began paying closer attention to Rebecca's behavior patterns, the label started to feel disturbingly accurate. She had an arsenal of techniques for inflicting emotional damage while maintaining plausible deniability. The concerned phone calls that always included painful updates about her own success, the social media posts that celebrated her fertility while subtly referencing other people's struggles, the family gatherings where she'd position herself as the golden child, the successful mother, the daughter who was giving our parents the grandchildren they deserved. Most insidiously, she'd begun rewriting the narrative of our relationship and my character. In conversations with our parents and extended family, Rebecca painted herself as the supportive sister, trying to help me through a difficult time, while portraying me as increasingly unstable and unreasonable in my grief. "I'm worried about Charlotte," I'd overheard her telling our cousin Jennifer during a family barbecue. "She's been so angry and paranoid since losing the baby. Yesterday she accused me of stealing her wedding dress, which is ridiculous since she told me I could borrow it. I think the grief is affecting her judgment, and I don't know how to help her." The conversation had been perfectly calibrated to generate sympathy for Rebecca while raising concerns about my mental state. Jennifer had responded with appropriate worry about my well-being and praise for Rebecca's patience in dealing with such a difficult situation. Within hours, I'd received concerned texts from multiple relatives asking if I was getting professional help for my grief and whether Daniel was monitoring my emotional stability. Rebecca had successfully transformed my legitimate anger about her cruelty into evidence of my own psychological problems. Every time I tried to address her behavior, I risked being seen as the unstable sister who couldn't handle her own loss and was taking it out on her pregnant sibling. The pattern became clearer when I started documenting the incidents. Daniel had suggested keeping a journal of interactions with Rebecca, partly for my own emotional processing, and partly because his diplomatic training had taught him the value of detailed records when dealing with people who weren't acting in good faith. What emerged from weeks of careful documentation was a systematic campaign of emotional terrorism. Rebecca called or texted every few days, always with some update designed to highlight her successful pregnancy or my failed one. She visited our parents at least twice a week, timing her appearances to coincide with my scheduled visits and always managing to dominate conversations with pregnancy-related topics. She'd begun borrowing other items from my closet without asking, claiming she'd mentioned it in passing and I'd given vague permission. A silk scarf here, a designer handbag there, always items that held sentimental value or that I'd worn during happier times. When I'd notice something missing and ask about it, she'd act surprised that I was keeping track of such trivial things and suggest that grief was making me materialistic and petty. The most devastating realization was that Rebecca seemed to be enjoying herself. There was a lightness in her step when she delivered particularly painful updates, a brightness in her eyes when she managed to reduce me to tears with her pointed comments. My suffering had become her entertainment, and my family's discomfort with confronting her behavior gave her a perfect shield of protection. She'd found the ideal weapon, the appearance of innocent sisterly interaction that was actually calculated cruelty. She could hurt me deeply while maintaining her reputation as the caring family member trying to help her grieving sister. Anyone who questioned her behavior could be dismissed as misunderstanding the situation or failing to appreciate how difficult it was to navigate family dynamics during times of loss. But Rebecca had made a critical error in her strategic planning. She'd been so focused on my vulnerability and our parents' desire for family harmony that she'd overlooked one crucial factor. Justice William Whitman hadn't spent 3 decades on the Supreme Court without developing a highly sophisticated understanding of evidence, patterns, and the difference between innocent behavior and calculated malice. And unlike our mother, who preferred surface-level peace to uncomfortable truths, our father had never been afraid of difficult conversations when justice was at stake. Rebecca was about to learn that some people don't ignore patterns of abuse just because they happen within families, and that having power means using it to protect the people you love from those who would exploit their vulnerability. The documentation Daniel and I had been gathering was about to become very important indeed. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in September, exactly 6 months after Emma's death, when Rebecca arrived unannounced at my office carrying what she claimed was a gift for me. I was in the middle of reviewing grant proposals for the Kennedy Center's Emerging Artists Program, when my assistant buzzed to tell me that my sister was in the lobby with something she insisted on delivering personally. Rebecca swept into my office wearing a flowing maternity dress that accentuated her now prominent belly at 7 months pregnant. She carried a large white gift box tied with an elaborate silver ribbon, her face glowing with the kind of excitement that immediately set off alarm bells in my mind. Over the past few months, I'd learned to associate Rebecca's enthusiasm with my own impending emotional devastation. "Charlotte, I have the most wonderful surprise for you," she announced, settling herself into the chair across from my desk, with the careful movements of someone in their 3rd trimester. "I know things have been difficult between us lately, and I wanted to do something special to show you how much I love you." The phrase "difficult between us" was a masterful reframing of months of systematic cruelty as mutual family tension. In Rebecca's version of events, we'd both contributed equally to whatever problems existed in our relationship, rather than acknowledging that she'd been waging a one-sided campaign of psychological warfare against her grieving sister. I accepted the box with cautious politeness, noting how Rebecca positioned herself to get the best view of my reaction. She had her phone out, ostensibly to capture the moment of sisterly gift-giving, but I suspected she was hoping to document whatever emotional breakdown she was planning to trigger. Inside the box, nestled in layers of white tissue paper, was a baby blanket. Not just any baby blanket. It was hand-knitted in soft yellow wool with intricate cable patterns and delicate ribbon trim. It was exactly the kind of heirloom piece that new mothers treasure for decades. The sort of gift that gets passed down through generations as a symbol of love and hope for the future. "I made it myself," Rebecca said, her voice warm with pride. "I know you don't have a baby to use it for right now, but I thought you might want to keep it for when you're ready to try again. I used the same pattern I'm using for William's blanket. I thought it would be nice for the cousins to have matching keepsakes." The cruelty was so perfectly calibrated that it took my breath away. Rebecca had spent months knitting a baby blanket for me, knowing that I had no baby to wrap in it and might never have one. She'd chosen to present it in my workplace, where I couldn't react emotionally without professional consequences. She'd framed it as a gesture of love and hope, while simultaneously reminding me of my loss and her impending success. But the most devastating detail was her casual mention that she was making an identical blanket for her own son. The gift wasn't really for me at all. It was a prop in her ongoing performance as the successful mother, the fertile sister, the woman who could create life both literally and figuratively through her knitting needles. "Rebecca," I said carefully, setting the blanket back in its box, "this is inappropriate. I can't accept this." Her face immediately shifted into an expression of hurt confusion, the look she'd perfected over months of practice. "I don't understand. I spent weeks making this for you because I love you, and I want you to know that I believe you'll be a mother someday. How is that inappropriate?" The question was delivered with perfect innocence, as if she genuinely couldn't comprehend why a grieving woman might find it painful to receive a baby blanket from her pregnant sister. It was the same tone she'd used when claiming she'd had permission to wear my wedding dress, the voice of someone whose actions were so obviously loving that any negative reaction must be evidence of the recipient's emotional instability. "You know exactly how this is inappropriate," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "You've spent months using my grief as entertainment, and now you're trying to frame your cruelty as generosity. I want you to leave my office now." Rebecca's performance shifted seamlessly into wounded martyrdom. Her eyes filled with tears, her hand moved protectively to her belly, and her voice took on the trembling quality of someone being unfairly attacked during her most vulnerable time. "Charlotte, I'm trying to help you heal," she said, her words carefully audible to my assistant and any colleagues who might be passing by my open office door. "I know you're in pain, but you can't keep taking it out on people who love you. This baby blanket represents hope and faith in your future, and I'm heartbroken that you're rejecting it." The public nature of her performance was calculated perfectly. Anyone overhearing our conversation would witness a pregnant woman offering a loving gift to her sister, only to be rejected and verbally attacked by someone who was clearly not handling her grief appropriately. Rebecca had created a scenario where any response I made would make me look unreasonable and cruel. But something had shifted in me during the months of documentation and Daniel's support. I was no longer the broken woman who doubted her own perceptions and made excuses for other people's behavior. I was angry, and my anger was giving me clarity instead of confusion. "Get out," I said, standing up from my desk with enough force that my chair rolled backward. "Take your blanket and your fake concern and get out of my office right now." Rebecca gathered the gift box slowly, making sure her movements appeared reluctant and hurt rather than triumphant. "I'll pray for you, Charlotte," she said as she reached the door. "I'll pray that you find peace, and that your heart opens to the love your family is trying to give you." The parting shot was delivered loud enough for half the office to hear, painting me as someone who was rejecting family love and spiritual guidance in favor of anger and bitterness. Rebecca left behind exactly the impression she'd intended, that she was a loving sister, trying to help someone who was too damaged to accept help. I sat in my office for 20 minutes after she left, staring at the space where the gift box had been and trying to process what had just happened. The blanket incident wasn't just cruel, it was strategic. Rebecca had escalated from stealing my belongings and making pointed comments to actively creating public scenes designed to damage my reputation while enhancing her own. That evening, I called Daniel at his office and asked him to come home early. When he arrived, I told him about the blanket incident in detail, watching his expression grow darker with each element of Rebecca's calculated performance. "She's escalating," he said when I finished. "This wasn't about giving you a gift or showing sisterly love. She wanted to create a public scene where you looked unstable, and she looked like a victim of your inappropriate behavior." Daniel's analysis was exactly what I'd feared. Rebecca had successfully manipulated the situation so that my completely reasonable rejection of her cruel gift would be remembered as evidence of my mental instability. By tomorrow, the story would spread throughout my professional network. Charlotte Whitman had verbally attacked her pregnant sister for offering her a baby blanket made with love. "We need to tell your father," Daniel said. "This has gone beyond family dynamics into something that could damage your career and your reputation. Justice Whitman needs to understand what Rebecca is really doing." The idea of involving my father felt both necessary and terrifying. Throughout my life, I'd tried to handle my own problems without running to him for help. Justice Whitman was one of the most powerful men in America, and I'd never wanted to be seen as someone who used family connections to solve personal difficulties. But this situation was beyond my ability to manage alone. Rebecca had systematically escalated her campaign to the point where she was now creating public incidents designed to damage my professional standing. She'd moved from private cruelty to public manipulation, and I needed someone with both the wisdom and the authority to stop her before she destroyed everything I'd worked to build. I called my parents' house that evening, asking if Daniel and I could come over for a private conversation. My mother answered, her voice immediately concerned when she heard the serious tone of my request. "Of course, darling. Is everything all right? You sound upset." "I need to talk to Dad about Rebecca," I said. "There are some things happening that he needs to know about." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When my mother finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. I see. Well, your father is in his study reviewing case briefs, but I'm sure he'll make time for you. Should I ask Rebecca to come as well? It might be good to have everyone together to discuss whatever's troubling you. The suggestion that Rebecca should be included in a conversation about her own systematic abuse was so tone-deaf that it confirmed my suspicions about my mother's role in enabling the situation. Patricia Whitman had spent months witnessing Rebecca's pointed comments and cruel timing, but she'd chosen to interpret everything through the lens of normal family friction, rather than acknowledging the pattern of deliberate cruelty. No, Mom, this needs to be a private conversation between Daniel, Dad, and me. Rebecca is the subject of what we need to discuss, not a participant in the discussion. Another long pause. Charlotte, I hope you're not going to cause unnecessary drama. Rebecca is 7 months pregnant, and she doesn't need additional stress. Whatever problems you think exist between you girls can surely be worked out with some patience and understanding. The conversation confirmed what I'd already suspected. Our mother was either willfully blind to Rebecca's behavior or actively complicit in it. Either way, she couldn't be trusted to acknowledge the truth or support appropriate consequences for Rebecca's actions. We'll be there in an hour, I said, ending the call before she could offer any more unsolicited advice about patience and understanding. As Daniel and I drove through the quiet streets of Georgetown toward my childhood home, I felt a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. For months I'd been fighting this battle alone, armed only with documentation and Daniel's diplomatic support. Tonight I would finally have the chance to present my case to someone with both the power and the moral authority to demand justice. Justice William Whitman had spent 30 years making decisions about right and wrong, about evidence and accountability, about the consequences that should follow deliberate harm. He'd built his reputation on careful analysis and principled judgment, never allowing personal relationships to compromise his commitment to truth. Rebecca had been so focused on my vulnerability and our mother's preference for harmony that she'd forgotten about our father's nature. She'd assumed that family loyalty would protect her from consequences, that being pregnant would shield her from accountability, that her carefully constructed image as the loving sister would outweigh any evidence of her actual behavior. She was about to learn that Justice Whitman hadn't spent 3 decades on the highest court in the land without developing very strong opinions about people who abuse their power to harm others. And unlike the rest of our family, he'd never been afraid to impose appropriate consequences when the evidence supported them. The reckoning Rebecca had been building toward through months of calculated cruelty was finally about to begin. Walking into my father's study felt like entering a temple of justice. The mahogany-paneled walls were lined with leather-bound legal volumes, framed Supreme Court decisions, and photographs of Justice William Whitman with every president since Reagan. Behind his massive oak desk hung his original appointment certificate, signed by President Clinton, and a portrait of Lady Justice that had been a gift from his law clerks on his 20th anniversary on the court. My father looked up from a stack of briefs as Daniel and I entered, his reading glasses perched on his nose and a cup of cold coffee forgotten at his elbow. At 68, Justice Whitman still commanded every room he entered, his silver hair perfectly groomed and his posture as straight as the day he'd taken his oath of office 3 decades earlier. "Charlotte, Daniel," he said, rising to embrace us both. "Your mother mentioned you wanted to discuss something serious about Rebecca. Please sit down and tell me what's troubling you." The next hour was one of the most difficult conversations of my life. I presented my case methodically, using the documentation skills Daniel had taught me, and the analytical framework I'd learned watching my father dissect complex legal arguments throughout my childhood. I started with the wedding dress incident, moved through the pattern of psychological manipulation, and concluded with that morning's baby blanket ambush. My father listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad in the precise handwriting that had terrified law clerks for decades. His expression remained neutral, giving no indication of his thoughts or reactions. This was Justice Whitman in full analytical mode, gathering evidence and reserving judgment until all facts were presented. When I finished, he set down his pen and looked at Daniel. "You've witnessed these incidents?" "Most of them, yes, sir," Daniel replied. "And I've helped Charlotte document the patterns and timing. This isn't normal sibling rivalry or pregnancy hormones. It's systematic psychological abuse designed to cause maximum emotional damage during Charlotte's most vulnerable period. My father nodded slowly, then turned back to me. You mentioned documentation. I'd like to see everything you have. Over the next 2 hours, Daniel and I presented the evidence we'd been gathering for months. The journal entries detailing each incident, complete with dates, times, and witnesses. Screenshots of Rebecca's social media posts, including the photos of her wearing my wedding dress with captions about family traditions and, quote, borrowed elegance. Phone records showing the timing of her calls, always clustered around significant dates like Emma's birthday or the anniversary of my loss. Most damning was the analysis Daniel had prepared, showing the correlation between my good days and Rebecca's supportive interventions. Every time I posted something positive on social media or mentioned progress in my healing to family members, Rebecca would call within 24 hours with pregnancy updates, or show up with some cruel gift disguised as sisterly love. This is remarkable documentation, my father said finally, reviewing the timeline we'd constructed. The pattern is undeniable, and the timing shows clear premeditation. Rebecca isn't responding emotionally to family dynamics. She's executing a calculated campaign designed to prevent your recovery from grief. The clinical assessment hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd known it intellectually for months. Hearing my father, one of the most respected legal minds in America, confirm that my sister had been systematically trying to destroy my mental health was both validating and devastating. The question now, Justice Whitman continued, is what remedy would be appropriate and effective. This behavior needs to stop immediately. But we also need to ensure it doesn't resume after consequences are imposed. My father stood and walked to the window overlooking my mother's rose garden, his hands clasped behind his back in the pose I remembered from childhood when he was working through particularly complex problems. The silence stretched for several minutes while he considered options and implications. I'm going to make some calls, he said finally. There are people who owe me favors. And some of those favors are about to be collected. Rebecca has made a serious error in judgment by targeting my daughter, and she's about to learn that actions have consequences even when they occur within families. The formal language was classic Justice Whitman, but underneath the judicial restraint I could hear something I'd rarely heard from my father: cold, controlled anger. Throughout my life, he'd been unfailingly even-tempered and diplomatic, even during the most contentious Supreme Court sessions. But someone had hurt his child systematically and deliberately, and that had awakened something protective and implacable. What kind of calls? I asked, though I suspected I might not want to know the answer. My father returned to his desk and opened a leather address book that looked older than I was. Rebecca teaches at Franklin Elementary in Richmond, correct? And Michael works for the city planning department? They have a mortgage through First National Bank? And Rebecca volunteers with the PTA and the church nursery program? The casual recitation of personal details about Rebecca's life was somehow more intimidating than any threat could have been. My father had spent 30 years in Washington, where information was power and influence was currency. The fact that he could casually list the pressure points in Rebecca's life suggested he'd already begun thinking strategically about how to respond to her behavior. Dad, I don't want you to destroy her life, I said, feeling suddenly frightened by the scope of power I'd unleashed. I just want her to stop. Charlotte, my father said gently, his voice carrying the patient tone he'd used to explain complex concepts when I was a child, your sister has spent months trying to destroy your emotional well-being during the most difficult period of your life. She's escalated to creating public incidents designed to damage your professional reputation. She's stolen your personal property and used it to mock your grief. This isn't a situation that will resolve itself through family discussions or appeals to her conscience. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through contacts with the efficiency of someone accustomed to wielding influence. Rebecca responds to power and consequences, not requests or reasoning. The only way to stop someone like her is to demonstrate that continuing her behavior will cost her more than stopping it. The first call was to someone my father addressed as James, spoken with the easy familiarity of old friendship. The conversation was brief and conducted in the kind of careful language that suggested both parties understood the implications without stating them explicitly. Yes, she's my younger daughter. That's right, Franklin Elementary. No, nothing illegal, but a pattern of harassment that needs to be addressed. I'd appreciate it if you could make some inquiries about her professional conduct. Thank you, James. The second call was to Margaret at what sounded like a bank or financial institution. This conversation focused on mortgage terms, payment histories, and the various ways that lending institutions could encourage responsible behavior from their clients without violating any regulations. The third call was the most chilling, placed to someone my father called Commissioner. The conversation was even more elliptical than the others, but I caught references to teaching certifications, background checks, and the importance of maintaining high standards for people who worked with children. She's been engaging in systematic harassment of a family member, my father explained. Nothing that would affect her classroom performance directly, but it raises questions about judgment and character that might be worth reviewing during her next evaluation period. By the time my father finished his calls, I felt like I'd witnessed a masterclass in how power actually worked in America. No threats had been made, no laws had been broken, and no improper pressure had been applied. But Rebecca's employer, her bank, and the state education department would all be taking a closer look at her circumstances in the coming weeks. What happens now? Daniel asked. Now we wait, my father replied. Rebecca will start receiving some inquiries about various aspects of her life. Her principal will want to discuss some complaints that have been raised about her professional conduct. Her mortgage company will want to review her loan terms and payment history. The state will want to update her background check for teaching certification renewal. The systematic nature of the response was breathtaking. Rebecca had attacked me on multiple fronts: emotional, social, and professional, and my father was responding with equal comprehensiveness. Every aspect of her stable, comfortable life was about to come under scrutiny simultaneously. Will she know it's connected to her behavior towards Charlotte? Daniel asked. Justice Whitman smiled for the first time that evening, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. Oh, she'll know. People always know when they're facing consequences for their actions, even when those consequences come through seemingly unrelated channels. The question is whether she'll be smart enough to stop her harassment campaign before these reviews uncover things that could permanently damage her career and financial stability. My father walked to his filing cabinet and pulled out a legal pad, beginning to draft what looked like a formal letter. I'm also going to prepare a cease and desist notice, written in my capacity as your legal representative rather than your father. It will document the pattern of harassment, demand immediate cessation of all contact, and warn of further legal action if the behavior continues. The letter was written in the kind of precise legal language that left no room for misinterpretation or wiggle room. It detailed specific incidents, cited relevant statutes about harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress, and made clear that continued contact would result in both civil and criminal consequences. This will be delivered by courier tomorrow morning, my father said, sealing the letter in an envelope marked Urgent, Legal Notice. Rebecca will understand that she's no longer dealing with family dynamics, but with legal accountability. As Daniel and I prepared to leave, my father pulled me into his arms for a hug that reminded me of childhood comfort after playground bullies or teenage heartbreak. But this embrace carried the added weight of adult protection, the assurance that someone with real power was finally standing between me and Rebecca's cruelty. I'm sorry I didn't see this pattern earlier, he said quietly. I assumed Rebecca was just struggling with normal family tensions, not executing a systematic campaign of psychological abuse. That was my failure, as both a father and a judge. You couldn't have known, I replied. She was very good at hiding her behavior and manipulating the narrative. Perhaps, but I should have noticed that one daughter was consistently flourishing while the other was consistently suffering, and asked myself why that pattern persisted. Good judges pay attention to patterns, and I failed to apply that skill to my own family. As we drove home through the quiet Georgetown streets, I felt a complex mixture of relief and apprehension. For months, I'd been fighting Rebecca's psychological warfare with nothing but documentation and determination. Now I had the full weight of Justice William Whitman's influence and connections supporting my cause. But I also understood that there was no going back from this moment. By involving my father and his network of powerful allies, I'd escalated our conflict beyond family dynamics into something that could permanently alter Rebecca's life. She'd forced this escalation through her own behavior, but the consequences would be swift and comprehensive. Rebecca had spent months believing that family loyalty would protect her from accountability, that her pregnancy would shield her from consequences, and that her carefully constructed image would outweigh any evidence of her actual behavior. She was about to learn that some battles couldn't be won through manipulation, and that some people had resources she couldn't match or counter. The investigation was now underway, and Justice William Whitman was a very thorough man. The first domino fell at 8:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning, exactly 72 hours after my father had made his strategic phone calls. Rebecca's principal, Dr. Sarah Martinez, called her into the office before classes began to discuss what she termed concerning reports about your conduct outside the workplace that may reflect on your professional judgment. I knew this because Rebecca called me in a panic 43 minutes later, violating the cease and desist order she'd received that same morning. Her voice was high and strained, lacking any of the calculated composure she'd maintained throughout months of psychological warfare. "Charlotte, what did you do?" she demanded without preamble. "Dr. Martinez is asking questions about my family relationships and whether I've been engaging in harassment." Someone told her, "I've been cruel to you during your grief, and she wants to discuss my fitness to work with children who might be experiencing family trauma." The irony was breathtaking. Rebecca had spent months positioning herself as the caring sister supporting someone through difficult times, but now her own narrative was being used against her. If she admitted to the harassment, she'd face professional consequences. If she denied it, she'd have to explain why multiple sources were reporting the same pattern of behavior. "I documented everything you did to me," I said calmly, putting the call on speaker so Daniel could witness this violation of the legal order, "including your systematic campaign to prevent my recovery from losing Emma." That documentation was shared with people who have the authority to evaluate whether your behavior reflects appropriate judgment for someone working with vulnerable children. "You vindictive bitch," Rebecca snarled, her carefully maintained facade finally cracking completely. "I'm 7 months pregnant, and you're trying to destroy my career over imagined slights and hurt feelings. Do you have any idea what you've done?" The vicious outburst was exactly what my father had predicted. When people who rely on manipulation and facade face real consequences, they inevitably reveal their true nature. Rebecca's mask of loving concern had disintegrated under pressure, exposing the calculating cruelty that had driven her behavior for months. "I'm hanging up now," I said. "Any further contact will be reported to the authorities as a violation of a legal order." "Don't you dare hang up on me," Rebecca screamed. "This isn't over, Charlotte. You think Daddy's connections will protect you forever, but—" I ended the call and immediately forwarded the recording to my father's office, along with a detailed summary of the conversation and its timing. Within an hour, his legal assistant had filed a formal complaint with the Richmond Police Department documenting Rebecca's violation of the cease and desist order. The second domino fell that afternoon when First National Bank's Loan Review Department contacted Michael about irregularities in their mortgage application and payment history. The inquiry was couched in routine language about updating customer files, but it included pointed questions about recent changes in household income, employment stability, and whether any family members had engaged in activities that might affect their creditworthiness. Michael called Daniel at the State Department, apparently hoping that professional courtesy between government employees might provide some insight into what was happening to their family. Daniel's response was diplomatically perfect. He expressed concern about their situation while making clear that any financial or legal difficulties they were experiencing were entirely separate from his relationship with them. "I hope everything works out for you both," Daniel had said. "Charlotte and I are focused on our own healing right now, and we're not in a position to get involved in other people's administrative matters." The third domino was the most devastating. The Virginia Department of Education's Professional Standards Division opened a formal inquiry into Rebecca's teaching certification, triggered by anonymous reports about her conduct outside the classroom. The inquiry would review her character and fitness to serve in a position of trust with children, including examination of any evidence suggesting poor judgment, harassment of family members, or other behavior inconsistent with professional ethics. Rebecca received the official notice on Friday afternoon, delivered by certified mail to both her home and her workplace. The letter was written in the bureaucratic language that makes government communications sound both mundane and terrifying, requesting her appearance at a hearing to address concerns about her professional conduct and moral character. That evening, my parents' house became a war zone. Rebecca arrived with Michael in tow, demanding a family meeting to address what she called Charlotte's vindictive campaign to destroy her life. My mother, caught between her desire for family harmony and the mounting evidence of Rebecca's behavior, tried to mediate a peace that was no longer possible. "Both of you girls need to stop this madness," Patricia said, her voice carrying the strain of someone whose worldview was crumbling. "Charlotte, surely you can call off these investigations now that you've made your point. Rebecca, you need to apologize for whatever you did to hurt your sister. This family cannot survive this kind of warfare." But my father had moved beyond the realm of family diplomacy into the arena of legal accountability. When Rebecca demanded that he use his influence to fix her professional problems, Justice Whitman's response was delivered with the cold precision of a Supreme Court decision. "Rebecca," he said, his voice carrying the authority that had shaped American jurisprudence for 3 decades. "You engaged in systematic psychological abuse of your sister during the most vulnerable period of her life. You stole her personal property and used it to mock her grief publicly. You escalated to creating workplace incidents designed to damage her professional reputation. These are not family squabbles. They are documented patterns of harassment that would be criminal if directed at a stranger." Rebecca tried to interrupt, but Justice Whitman continued with the inexorable logic that had made him legendary in legal circles. "You now face professional reviews because your behavior raises legitimate questions about your judgment, character, and fitness to work with vulnerable populations. These reviews are not punishment. They are appropriate due diligence that should have been conducted earlier." The confrontation escalated when Rebecca played her final card, claiming that the stress of the investigations was threatening her pregnancy and that I was essentially trying to harm her unborn child. It was a desperate manipulation tactic designed to make me appear to be targeting an innocent baby rather than holding an adult accountable for her actions. "If stress is affecting your pregnancy," my father replied with clinical detachment, "I suggest you consult with your obstetrician about appropriate stress management techniques. However, the consequences of your documented harassment campaign cannot be suspended because you chose to engage in that behavior while pregnant." Michael, who had remained silent through most of the confrontation, finally spoke up with the defeated tone of someone whose life was collapsing around him. "What do you want from us? What will it take to make this stop?" The question hung in the air like a surrender flag. For months, Rebecca had held all the power in our relationship, able to inflict pain while maintaining her innocent facade. Now she was the one begging for terms, desperate to escape consequences she couldn't manipulate or control. "Complete cessation of all contact with Charlotte," my father said. "Return of all personal property that was taken without permission. Public acknowledgement that the harassment campaign was inappropriate and will not continue. Full cooperation with all professional reviews, including honest answers about your behavior patterns." "And if Rebecca complies with these terms?" Michael asked. "Then the reviews will proceed based on facts rather than ongoing patterns of misconduct. The outcomes will depend on what the investigations uncover and how professional standards are applied. I cannot and will not interfere with legitimate regulatory processes." Rebecca's face went white as she realized the full scope of her situation. The professional reviews would proceed regardless of her cooperation, but continued harassment would only make her situation worse. She had no leverage left, no manipulation tactics that could work against documented evidence and institutional accountability. "This is all your fault," she said to me, her voice filled with venom. "Everything that happens to my family, to my career, to my baby, it's all because you couldn't handle a little family teasing. You've destroyed everything over your inability to take a joke." The characterization of months of systematic cruelty as a little family teasing was so grotesque that even my mother flinched. Rebecca had learned nothing from the consequences she was facing, still clinging to her victim narrative, even as evidence of her calculated malice mounted around her. "Rebecca," I said quietly, "you made your choices every day for months. You chose to steal my wedding dress and wear it to mock my grief. You chose to bring me a baby blanket as a public humiliation. You chose to use my daughter's death as entertainment for your social media followers. Everything happening to you now is the direct result of decisions you made deliberately and repeatedly. The confrontation ended with Rebecca storming out of our parents' house, screaming threats about lawyers and family loyalty and the terrible things that would happen when her powerful friends learned how she was being treated. But her threats rang hollow against the reality of documented evidence and institutional accountability. Michael lingered for a moment, looking older and more defeated than I'd ever seen him. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I knew she was being cruel to you, but I didn't realize how systematic it was. I should have stopped her months ago." The admission confirmed what I'd suspected, that Rebecca's behavior hadn't been secret or spontaneous, but a calculated campaign that others had witnessed and chosen not to address. Michael's guilt was real, but it was the guilt of enablement rather than innocence. As they left, my father placed his arm around my shoulders with the protective gesture that had comforted me throughout childhood. But this time the comfort came with the satisfaction of justice properly applied. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I can finally breathe," I replied. "For the first time in months, I feel like someone with power is on my side instead of against me." The legal battle was far from over, but the power dynamic had shifted permanently. Rebecca was no longer the predator-stalking vulnerable prey. She was the defendant facing institutional accountability for documented misconduct. And Justice William Whitman was a very thorough prosecutor when family members had been harmed. The Virginia Department of Education's hearing room felt like a courtroom designed specifically for ending careers. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across beige walls, and the conference table where Rebecca sat with her hastily hired attorney seemed to shrink under the weight of accumulated evidence spread before the three-member review panel. I wasn't required to attend, but my father had suggested my presence would demonstrate the seriousness of the matter and provide the panel with an opportunity to assess the impact of Rebecca's behavior firsthand. Daniel sat beside me in the gallery, his diplomatic training helping him maintain appropriate composure while I struggled with the surreal experience of watching my sister's professional life dissected by strangers. The panel chair, Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne, was a veteran educator with 30 years of experience dealing with professional misconduct cases. She reviewed the evidence with the methodical precision of someone who had seen every possible form of inappropriate behavior and developed immunity to excuses and manipulation. "Ms. Collins," Dr. Hawthorne said, using Rebecca's married name with formal distance, "we have received extensive documentation regarding your conduct toward your sister following her pregnancy loss in March. Can you explain why you believed it was appropriate to wear her wedding dress to a family gathering without permission?" Rebecca's attorney, a nervous young man named David Kim who specialized in employment law, had clearly advised her to take responsibility and express remorse. But Rebecca's fundamental nature made genuine accountability impossible, even when her career hung in the balance. "I made an error in judgment," she said, her voice carefully modulated to sound contrite. "I was dealing with my own pregnancy emotions and didn't fully consider how my actions might affect my sister during her difficult time. I've since realized that my behavior was insensitive." The response was textbook damage control. Acknowledge a mistake without admitting malicious intent, claim emotional mitigation, and express vague regret without specific accountability. It might have worked if the panel hadn't also reviewed the extensive timeline my father's team had prepared, showing the calculated nature of Rebecca's campaign. Dr. Hawthorne consulted her notes, then looked up with the expression of someone who had just heard an insult to her intelligence. "Ms. Collins, the documentation shows that you visited your sister's home on multiple occasions to search through her personal belongings. You specifically sought out this wedding dress, removed it without permission, and wore it to a family event where it would be photographed and posted on social media. This suggests premeditation rather than impulsive emotional reaction." The panel member to her left, Mr. Gerald Foster, leaned forward with interest. "Additionally, we have records of social media posts you made over several months, including content that appears to mock your sister's pregnancy loss and suggests that infertile women don't deserve children. Can you explain how this pattern of behavior aligns with your professional responsibilities as someone who works with children from diverse family situations, including those who may have experienced loss or trauma?" Rebecca's carefully prepared composure began to crack, Her attorney whispered something urgent in her ear, but she pushed him away with visible irritation. The same arrogance that had driven her harassment campaign was now sabotaging her defense. My social media posts were private communications with friends about family dynamics, she said, her voice rising defensively. They were taken out of context and misinterpreted by people who wanted to make me look bad. I never said anything directly cruel about my sister's situation. The third panel member, Ms. Andrea Lopez, opened a folder and began reading from printed screenshots. Quote, "Some people think expensive treatments can buy them what others get naturally. But bodies know when someone isn't meant to be a mother." Posted 3 days after your sister's miscarriage. Quote, "Watching someone blame everyone except themselves for their failures is exhausting. Maybe the universe is trying to tell her something." Posted 1 week after her loss. The direct quotations hit the room like physical blows. Rebecca's face went pale as her own words were read back to her in the sterile environment of a professional hearing. The casual cruelty that had seemed clever when shared with sympathetic friends sounded monstrous when delivered by a neutral observer. "These posts were private," Rebecca stammered. "I was processing my own emotions about difficult family situations. People should be allowed to have private conversations with friends without being held professionally accountable for every word." Dr. Hawthorne's expression grew colder. "Ms. Collins, you posted this content on social media platforms, where it was visible to dozens of people, including parents of children you teach. Moreover, your role as an elementary school teacher requires you to demonstrate compassion and sound judgment when working with children who may be experiencing family trauma, including pregnancy loss within their families. These posts suggest a troubling lack of empathy that directly relates to your professional competency." The hearing continued for 2 more hours, with the panel methodically reviewing every documented incident of Rebecca's harassment campaign. The baby blanket workplace ambush, the systematic timing of cruel phone calls, the theft and public display of personal property, the social media posts celebrating her fertility while mocking my losses. Each incident, examined individually, might have been dismissed as poor judgment or family friction, but the timeline revealed what my father had recognized immediately: a calculated pattern of psychological abuse designed to prevent my recovery from grief and maximize my emotional suffering. Rebecca's attorney made a valiant attempt to reframe the situation as mutual family conflict, suggesting that both sisters had contributed to escalating tensions and that pregnancy hormones had affected his client's judgment. But the evidence was overwhelmingly one-sided, showing months of documented harassment with no reciprocal behavior from me. "Your Honor," Mr. Kim said, using the wrong title and immediately correcting himself, "I'm sorry, Dr. Hawthorne. My client is 7 months pregnant and facing enormous stress from these proceedings. She's acknowledged that her judgment was impaired during a difficult family period, and she's committed to professional counseling to address any communication issues that may have contributed to misunderstandings with her sister." The characterization of systematic psychological abuse as, quote, "communication issues and misunderstandings" was so tone-deaf that Dr. Hawthorne actually looked offended. The panel had spent hours reviewing evidence of deliberate cruelty, and Rebecca's attorney was still trying to minimize it as normal family dysfunction. "Mr. Kim," Dr. Hawthorne said with dangerous quiet, "your client engaged in behavior that would constitute harassment and stalking if directed toward a stranger. The fact that the victim was her sister experiencing pregnancy loss makes the conduct more disturbing, not less. Teachers are held to high standards of moral character because they work with vulnerable populations who deserve protection from individuals who might exploit their vulnerabilities." The panel deliberated for 45 minutes before returning with their decision. Dr. Hawthorne's voice carried the weight of institutional authority as she delivered the verdict that would reshape Rebecca's future. The Virginia Department of Education finds that Rebecca Collins engaged in conduct unbecoming a professional educator and demonstrating unfitness to work with children. Her teaching certification is hereby suspended pending completion of a comprehensive psychological evaluation and professional counseling program. Reinstatement will require demonstration of rehabilitated character and fitness, including letters of recommendation from mental health professionals and evidence of meaningful accountability for past misconduct. Rebecca's reaction was immediate and devastating. She began sobbing uncontrollably, her carefully maintained facade finally collapsing under the weight of real consequences. Michael, who had been sitting in the back of the room, moved to comfort her, but his own expression showed the resignation of someone whose life had just fundamentally changed. Additionally, Dr. Hawthorne continued, this decision will be noted in Ms. Collins' permanent professional record and reported to relevant authorities in any state where she might seek teaching certification in the future. Professional misconduct involving harassment of family members raises serious questions about character and judgment that must be disclosed to future employers. The aftermath was swift and comprehensive. Franklin Elementary School, faced with the state's determination that Rebecca was unfit to work with children, had no choice but to terminate her employment immediately. First National Bank, reviewing their mortgage in light of the household's sudden loss of income, began foreclosure proceedings when October's payment was missed. The social consequences were equally devastating. Word of the professional hearing spread quickly through Richmond's tight-knit education community, where Rebecca had built her identity as a dedicated teacher and involved parent. The same social media networks she'd used to mock my grief now buzzed with speculation about her misconduct and the dramatic fall from grace. 3 weeks after the hearing, Rebecca made one final attempt at manipulation, calling me from a blocked number to plead for my intervention with the education department. Her voice was different now, broken, desperate, stripped of the calculating confidence that had driven months of cruelty. "Charlotte, please," she begged. "I'm 8 months pregnant, we're losing the house, and I can't find work anywhere. The stress is affecting the baby. Can't you find it in your heart to forgive me and help me get my certification back?" The appeal to my compassion was classic Rebecca, assuming that my capacity for empathy could be weaponized against me one more time. But months of documentation and my father's strategic guidance had taught me the difference between compassion and enabling. "Rebecca," I said calmly, "you spent months using my grief as entertainment and trying to prevent my healing from losing Emma. You stole my wedding dress and wore it to mock my pain publicly. You created workplace incidents designed to damage my professional reputation. Every consequence you're facing now is the direct result of choices you made deliberately and repeatedly." "But I'm your sister," she cried. "Doesn't that mean anything to you?" "You used that relationship as a weapon against me," I replied. "You counted on family loyalty to protect you from accountability, while you systematically tried to destroy my mental health. You don't get to claim sisterly love now that you're facing consequences for your actions." I hung up and blocked the number, then called my father to report the contact violation. Within hours, Rebecca received a formal warning from the Richmond Police Department that any further attempts to contact me would result in criminal charges for stalking and harassment. That evening, Daniel and I sat on our back patio watching the sunset over Georgetown, finally able to enjoy the peace that had been missing from our lives for so many months. Rebecca's campaign of psychological terrorism was ended not by appeals to family harmony or gradual change, but by institutional accountability and the systematic application of appropriate consequences. "How does it feel?" Daniel asked, taking my hand as the sky darkened around us. "Like justice," I said, surprised by how accurately the word captured my emotions. Not revenge, not cruelty, just the simple recognition that actions have consequences, and that people who harm others should be held accountable for their choices. The war Rebecca had started with stolen clothing and calculated cruelty was finally over. She had lost everything: her career, her home, her reputation, and her family relationships. Not because I had been vindictive, but because Justice William Whitman had applied the same principles to family dynamics that he'd used to shape American jurisprudence for 3 decades. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against systematic abuse isn't forgiveness or understanding. It's simply the unwavering application of appropriate consequences by people who refuse to let family relationships excuse deliberate harm. 1 year later, I stood in the gleaming conference room of the newly established Emma Whitman Foundation, watching as our board of directors reviewed the first annual report of an organization that had grown beyond my wildest dreams. The foundation, named for my daughter and funded initially by a substantial donation from Justice Whitman, had become a beacon of hope for families navigating pregnancy loss, infertility, and the complex grief that follows reproductive trauma. The irony wasn't lost on me that Rebecca's systematic cruelty had ultimately led to something beautiful and meaningful. Her attempts to weaponize my grief had instead taught me the power of transforming pain into purpose, of using personal experience to create systemic change that could help thousands of other families facing similar struggles. "Charlotte," said Dr. Amanda Richardson, our foundation's Director of Counseling Services, "the support group program has grown to serve over 300 families across the DMV area. We're receiving requests to expand into Virginia Beach, Richmond, and Baltimore." The testimonials from participants are extraordinary. Many cite the foundation as the primary reason they were able to begin healing after reproductive loss. The mention of Richmond gave me a momentary pause. Rebecca had delivered her son William in November, a month after losing her teaching position and 2 weeks before their house went into foreclosure. Through mutual acquaintances, I'd heard that she and Michael had moved in with his parents while she searched for work outside education. Her attempts to find employment had been hampered by the professional misconduct finding, which appeared in background checks and required explanation to potential employers. But I felt no satisfaction in her continued struggles, only a deep sense of closure that came from seeing justice appropriately applied. Rebecca had made her choices deliberately and repeatedly, and the consequences she faced were proportional to the harm she'd inflicted. More importantly, those consequences had created space for healing and growth that wouldn't have been possible if her behavior had continued unchecked. Daniel walked into the conference room carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the proud smile that had become my daily reminder of how much our relationship had deepened through adversity. Our marriage had emerged from the Rebecca crisis stronger and more authentic, built on a foundation of genuine partnership rather than the polite companionship that had characterized our early years together. "The senator's office just called," he said, settling into the chair beside mine with the easy intimacy that had replaced our former careful politeness. "Senator Williams wants to discuss federal funding for reproductive trauma counseling programs. Apparently your testimony before the Health Committee last month made quite an impression." The congressional testimony had been terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Standing before a room full of senators and representatives, speaking about Emma's brief life and the systematic harassment that had followed her death, I'd felt the full weight of my father's legacy and the responsibility that came with having a platform powerful enough to create policy change. "We're not just talking about individual grief," I'd told the committee. "We're talking about a public health crisis that affects millions of American families. Pregnancy loss occurs in approximately 25% of recognized pregnancies, yet our medical system provides virtually no psychological support for the trauma that follows. Families are left to navigate devastating grief alone, often facing additional stress from well-meaning but harmful responses from their communities." The senators had listened with the kind of respectful attention that my father's reputation commanded, but their questions had revealed genuine interest in addressing a problem that touched virtually every American family in some way. Within weeks, preliminary discussions had begun about federal funding for comprehensive reproductive trauma support programs. Dr. Richardson continued her presentation, highlighting success stories that demonstrated the foundation's impact on real families facing impossible situations. Sarah Mitchell, whose 4th pregnancy had ended in stillbirth at 36 weeks, had found the strength to advocate for better hospital bereavement protocols after participating in our peer support program. James and Maria Santos had successfully navigated their grief journey and gone on to adopt twins after our counseling services helped them process their fertility struggles without destroying their marriage. Each story represented a family that might have suffered in isolation without the resources we'd created from my own experience of systematic harassment and eventual recovery. Rebecca's cruelty had inadvertently sparked a movement that was changing how American society approached reproductive trauma and family healing. The Foundation's work had also led to unexpected professional opportunities that had reshaped my career in profound ways. Georgetown University's Graduate School of Social Policy had offered me a position as a lecturer in trauma-informed family services, teaching future social workers and policy professionals about the intersection of personal grief and systemic support needs. My first lecture was to a class of 25 graduate students, most of them younger than me, and eager to change the world through direct service or policy advocacy. Standing at the podium, looking out at their expectant faces, I'd felt the weight of responsibility that came with transforming personal pain into professional expertise. Trauma doesn't exist in isolation, I'd told them. When someone experiences reproductive loss, they're not just grieving the death of a child or the failure of their reproductive system. They're confronting every assumption they've made about fairness, control, and their own worth. They're navigating medical systems that treat them as malfunctioning machines rather than human beings experiencing existential crisis. They're dealing with family and social dynamics that often compound their pain rather than providing support. The students had responded with thoughtful questions and genuine engagement, many sharing their own experiences with family trauma or their motivations for entering social service fields. Teaching had given me a sense of purpose that went beyond individual healing, allowing me to influence the next generation of professionals who would work with families in crisis. But the most profound transformation had been in my relationship with my parents, particularly with Justice Whitman, whose decisive intervention had not only stopped Rebecca's harassment but had also revealed depths of protective love that I'd never fully appreciated during my childhood. "I've been thinking about something," my father had said during one of our weekly dinners, a tradition we'd established after the Foundation's launch. "Throughout my career on the court, I've prided myself on analytical thinking and evidence-based decision-making. But I failed to apply those same skills to my own family dynamics for far too long." We'd been sitting in his study, the same room where I'd first presented evidence of Rebecca's systematic cruelty, but the atmosphere now was one of reflection rather than crisis. My father had developed a habit of reviewing his own parenting decisions, with the same rigorous analysis he'd once applied to constitutional law. "I should have recognized the pattern much earlier," he'd continued. "One daughter consistently flourishing while the other consistently struggled, timing that was too precise to be coincidental, behavior that escalated systematically rather than randomly. The signs were all there, but I chose to interpret them as normal family friction, rather than investigating further." His self-criticism had been gentle but thorough, the reflections of someone who'd learned important lessons about the difference between maintaining harmony and enabling abuse. Our relationship had deepened through his willingness to acknowledge his oversights and his commitment to being more observant and protective going forward. My mother's transformation had been more complex and ultimately incomplete. Patricia Whitman had struggled to reconcile the evidence of Rebecca's systematic cruelty with her lifelong commitment to family unity, and her belief that love could overcome any conflict through patience and understanding. "I still don't understand how things got so bad between you girls," she'd said during a difficult conversation several months after Rebecca's hearing. "I keep thinking that if I'd tried harder to bring you together, if I'd been more insistent about family forgiveness, maybe none of this would have happened." The persistent belief that Rebecca's calculated harassment campaign was somehow a mutual failure of sisterly communication had created a permanent rift in my relationship with my mother. I loved her deeply, but I could no longer pretend that her worldview was compatible with my need for accountability and appropriate boundaries. Daniel and I had made peace with the reality that some family relationships couldn't survive the transition from dysfunction to health. My mother's inability to acknowledge the severity of Rebecca's behavior, her continued references to the situation as a, quote, misunderstanding between sisters, and her occasional suggestions that family healing required my forgiveness and restored contact with Rebecca, had made it clear that she would always prioritize the appearance of harmony over the reality of abuse. The most unexpected aspect of my transformation had been the gradual shift in how I thought about motherhood and family creation. For months after losing Emma, I'd been consumed by the need to become pregnant again, to prove that my body could successfully carry a child to term, to replace what I'd lost with a new life that would somehow retroactively justify my grief. But the Foundation's work had introduced me to dozens of families who'd found different paths to parenthood and fulfillment, many of whom had discovered that their struggles with fertility had led them to opportunities they wouldn't have considered otherwise. Adoption, foster care, mentorship programs, and professional work with children had all become viable expressions of maternal instinct for women whose bodies couldn't or wouldn't cooperate with traditional pregnancy. "I've been thinking about something," I'd told Daniel one evening as we walked through our Georgetown neighborhood, past the parks and playgrounds that had once felt like monuments to my failure. "What if our path to parenthood doesn't involve pregnancy at all? What if we're meant to build our family through adoption or foster care? providing homes for children who need them. The conversation had continued over weeks and months, evolving from tentative exploration to serious commitment. We'd begun the adoption process 6 months earlier, working with an agency that specialized in placing older children who'd been in foster care and needed permanent homes. The process was complex and emotionally demanding, but it felt authentic in a way that fertility treatments never had. "The agency called this morning," Daniel said, pulling me back to the present moment in the Foundation's conference room. "They have a sibling group they'd like us to meet, 2 sisters ages 8 and 10 who've been in care for 3 years and need a family that can keep them together." The possibility of becoming parents to 2 school-age children who'd experienced their own trauma and loss felt like the natural evolution of everything I'd learned about healing, family, and the difference between what we want and what we're meant to have. These children wouldn't replace Emma or erase the grief of losing her, but they would create new meaning and purpose that honored both my experience of loss and my capacity for love. The Foundation board meeting concluded with unanimous approval of our expansion plans and increased funding for family counseling services. As the directors filed out, discussing implementation strategies and fundraising goals, I remained in the conference room with Daniel, looking out at the Washington skyline that had witnessed both my devastation and my recovery. "Do you ever think about Rebecca?" Daniel asked, following my gaze toward the distant Virginia suburbs where my sister was presumably rebuilding her life under the shadow of professional disgrace and financial ruin. "Sometimes," I admitted, but not with anger anymore. "Mostly I think about how different things might have been if she'd channeled her intelligence and energy into something constructive instead of destructive. She was capable of so much more than the cruelty she chose." The truth was that Rebecca had taught me invaluable lessons about resilience, justice, and the importance of having powerful allies when facing systematic abuse. Her calculated campaign had forced me to develop skills in documentation, analysis, and strategic thinking that were now serving thousands of families through the Foundation's work. Her harassment had strengthened my marriage, deepened my relationship with my father, and led to a career that felt genuinely meaningful for the first time in my life. "I'm grateful for the experience now," I continued, surprised by my own words but recognizing their truth. "Not grateful for the pain she caused, but grateful for what I learned about my own strength and the importance of fighting back against people who try to exploit vulnerability." That evening, Daniel and I hosted a dinner party for Foundation supporters and board members, the kind of sophisticated social gathering that had once felt impossible during the depths of my grief. Our Georgetown townhouse filled with laughter and meaningful conversation, the sound of people united by shared purpose rather than mere social obligation. Among the guests was Dr. Elena Vasquez, a reproductive psychiatrist who'd become both a professional colleague and a personal friend. She'd been instrumental in developing the Foundation's clinical protocols and had co-authored several papers with me about trauma-informed approaches to pregnancy loss counseling. "Charlotte," she said as we stood together on the back terrace, watching stars emerge in the clear October sky, "I want you to know that your willingness to transform personal trauma into professional expertise has influenced how I practice medicine. The Foundation's work has taught me to see patients as whole human beings, navigating complex family and social dynamics, not just medical cases requiring technical intervention." The conversation reminded me of how profoundly my life had changed in the years since Justice Whitman had made those strategic phone calls that ended Rebecca's harassment campaign. I was no longer the broken woman who'd sat in silence while her sister used her grief as entertainment. I was someone who'd fought back successfully, created meaningful work from personal pain, and built a life that honored both my losses and my capacity for growth. Later that night, as Daniel and I prepared for bed, he showed me the adoption agency's preliminary profiles of the 2 sisters we might soon call our daughters. 8-year-old Sophia loved to read and wanted to be a veterinarian. 10-year-old Isabella was passionate about art and hoped to study fashion design someday. They'd been separated from their biological parents due to neglect, and had been waiting in foster care for a permanent family that could provide stability and support their individual dreams. "They've been through trauma," Daniel said, studying their photographs with the careful attention he'd once reserved for diplomatic briefings. "But so have we. Maybe that shared experience of loss and recovery will help us understand each other in ways that traditional families can't. The idea that our own journey through systematic abuse and eventual justice might help us provide better support for children who'd experienced different but equally challenging trauma felt like the perfect culmination of everything I'd learned about transforming pain into purpose. As I fell asleep that night, I thought about Emma and the brief life that had taught me so much about love, loss, and the unpredictable ways that meaning emerges from suffering. Rebecca had tried to use my daughter's death as a weapon against me, but Emma's legacy had instead become a foundation for healing that was touching hundreds of families and potentially influencing federal policy. The wedding dress that Rebecca had stolen and worn to mock my grief was long gone, returned and then donated to a charity that provided formal wear for women entering the workforce after periods of homelessness or domestic violence. Like everything else from that difficult period, it had been transformed from a symbol of pain into a tool for someone else's empowerment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: meetings with adoption social workers, foundation board decisions, university lectures, and congressional testimony preparation. But tonight, I slept peacefully in the knowledge that I'd successfully transformed systematic cruelty into systematic healing, that I'd found my voice and used it to protect not only myself, but countless other families facing similar struggles. Rebecca had intended to destroy me emotionally while maintaining her facade of sisterly concern. Instead, she'd created the circumstances for my complete transformation, from victim to advocate, from broken grieving woman to powerful force for policy change and family healing. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't about defeating your enemies. They're about discovering that you're stronger than you ever imagined, and that your pain can become the foundation for someone else's hope. The war Rebecca had started with the stolen dress had ended with my complete triumph, not just over her cruelty, but over every limitation I'd once accepted about my own capacity for resilience, justice, and meaningful contribution to the world. The little girl who'd once sat in Justice Whitman's study, listening to him explain complex legal principles, had grown up to apply those same principles to her own life with devastating effectiveness. And the woman who'd once felt powerless against systematic family abuse had discovered that she possessed resources, allies, and inner strength that no amount of calculated cruelty could ultimately defeat. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.